If you grew up anytime relatively close to the late 90s or early 2000s, you probably have a distinct emotional association with this song. This scene from Up, where we see the main character fall into and then eventually lose the love of his life in just a brief couple minutes, is famous to the point of trope. Capturing such an intense emotional story from start to finish in such a short amount of time is incredibly impressive, a feat of technical skill. And in revisiting Frieren Beyond Journey's End, I noticed that in episode 2, they capture an entire story in 9 minutes. My name is Pei, and today we're talking about how Frieren succeeded in 9 minutes where other shows fail across the years. A distinct part of what makes Frieren Beyond Journey's End a very special show is its ability to capture complex stories in brief amounts of time. In many ways, this show can feel aimless, but part of what counteracts that and makes it so engaging is its ability to capture beauty in the mundane, making things that feel slow, engaging, and captivating. Anime in general, especially older shows, is infamous for having pacing problems. And while Frieren absolutely takes its time, this show finds ways to make it work remarkably well. At the end of episode 1, we had Frieren lost in the woods looking for her good friend Hyder's home. She runs into a young girl named Fern, who is a ward of Hyder's. She leads Frieren to their home, and over tea, Hyder makes a request. Fern shows promise as a mage, and as Hyder's coming up on the end of his life, he asks Frieren to take her along as an apprentice. Frieren shares that this is something she cannot do, as this young girl's magical skill is not up to snuff, and it's an incredibly dangerous profession to be a mage's apprentice. Quickly acquiescing, Hyder instead asks another favor. He requests that she translate a grimoire that might have access to some sort of magic that could prolong his life. And given that it would take a couple years, maybe she could teach Fern some magic in her free time. Frieren agrees, and when she finds Fern with a staff much too big for her out practicing magic in the wilderness, Fern shares a goal, to blast a hole in a distant rock. Apparently Hyder had stated that as soon as she could do that, she'd be a proper mage. Though when she tries, her spell dissipates well before it lands. Debating whether or not to teach Fern, Frieren asks her a question. Do you like magic? To which Fern responds, somewhat. This leads into the second episode, which follows our distinct story that's told so expertly. The episode is titled, It Didn't Have to Be Magic. So what defines a fully fleshed out story versus a component of one? What differentiates what Frieren and Up have done from, let's say, a flashback? Frieren's story is one that's complete, with a beginning, middle, and end. It could function as a short story, consumed on its own from start to finish. Whereas a flashback is often a component of a larger story, it's providing context and setup. When I was learning how to write better, in this case specifically applying to novels, there was an argument that one teacher made that each chapter should function as a standalone story, one with a beginning, middle, and end that ultimately ties into the overarching story that the book is telling. The main argument for this is that it helps a lot with pacing and engagement, and we actually see this a lot in episodic television where each episode can be consumed in a complete vacuum. There's this idea from the renowned fantasy author and educator Brandon Sanderson that I call bracketed ideas. To paraphrase his argument, he states that a story is built from promises and follow-through, the former being represented by the opening of a bracket and the latter being represented by the closing of a bracket. I like using Avatar: The Last Airbender to exemplify this. Aang is the avatar who's destined to save the world, so theoretically he will save the world. That is the promise the story's making. Now, an important component of this is while you could simplify a story to one larger set of brackets, more often than not, they're composed of many smaller forms of brackets. So a crucial part of this argument that Sanderson is making is that a component of what makes the finale so special is that so many of these brackets are closing at once. When done right, it's an incredibly satisfying experience. And part of what makes this scene so interesting to me from Frieren is the fact that it is a full story on its own, not just a component of one. And not only that, it has a finale where multiple brackets close at once in a way that to me was very satisfying. So before I move on and start to analyze this story, I want to talk about another concept, which is representing a story as a graph. If the x-axis is the progression of the story, and the y-axis is the arc of the story, well then this box would be what the story is. And when it's done well, it would be able to imply things beyond the box, like what events came before and after. But you could also add a z-axis, this one breaking the fourth wall, by asking how this story affects things beyond it. This access would represent things like how moral themes in a story impact your own sense of morality and actions, or how any lessons from a story impacts its audience. It's kind of like, how does the story apply beyond itself? So let's start first with the idea of those brackets that I explained earlier and apply that to Frieren's story from the first half of episode 2. So in this story, there are 3 characters that we've already introduced: Fern, Hyder, and Frieren. Each of these characters have a distinct arc. Let's start first with Hyder's, the alcoholic priest who sees a young girl on the verge of giving up. Inspired by Himmel's heroism and kindness, Hyder tries to do what Himmel would have done, but in taking on such a severe responsibility near the end of his life, he'd like to see it through. But fearing his own death and what it represents for Fern, Hyder would like to create a situation in which she is secure and safe going forward. And in many ways, the main conflict and adversity to this story is Hyder's impending death. Which leads us next to Fern's arc. She pursues magic as a way of showing her appreciation for what Hyder has done for her, almost as if she's aware of Hyder's fears and trying to eliminate them. But I also think it's for her to prove that his kindness was not a mistake. And then next we have Frieren, someone who's trying to change, to break deeply ingrained habits and form connections with those around her. And in visiting Hyder, she's showcasing that change. She offers him a favor, but when he requests that she take on Fern as an apprentice, she can't accept. A little too aware of the realities and dangers of being a mage's apprentice, Frieren can't in good conscience take on Fern as an apprentice, especially given her current magical ability. So instead, Hyder requests that she translate a grimoire that might have access to some sort of spell that might prolong his life. And in her free time, maybe she can help Fern in her pursuit of magic. This is the basis of each character's arc, the story represented by a box on a graph. And looking at that z-axis, what this media applies beyond itself. This story carries a beautiful theme in the expression of love. And we see that most in the way the story arcs play out to their end. When Hyder in his old age collapses, we approach the emotional crux of the story. And each character's response is actually fascinating. Finding Fern practicing magic in a storm, Frieren urges her to spend the little time she has left with Hyder, fittingly trying to help Fern not make the same mistake she did in the first episode. But she refuses, dead set on achieving her goal, proving to Hyder that he has nothing to worry about, that his choice to save her was not a mistake. Then surprisingly, Frieren accepts Fern's decision, and having finished translating the grimoire, Frieren approaches Hyder on his deathbed. She shares that this grimoire offers no magical solution to Hyder's fear of death, but then she realizes the truth behind his actions, that in translating the grimoire, she did actually find a solution to that fear. It's revealed that Fern has achieved her goal, blasted a hole in that rock and proven herself to be a worthy mage to accompany Frieren. Hyder asks that they leave before he passes, indicating that any day he'll die. But this request Frieren denies. And this is where all 3 arcs come to a close. Fern has achieved her goal, allowing both her and Frieren to repay their debt to Hyder. A debt that was not born from obligation or necessity, but from love. And spending the little time they have left together, Fern and Hyder laugh and talk, before suddenly we find them pouring wine on his gravestone. The start of a fantastic journey built off of the foundation of a remarkable story told in 9 minutes. Thank you. If you enjoyed this video, come back next week and I'll have another, or go check out the one I did last week. If you want to support me as a creator and this series as a whole, consider going to my Patreon. I have 4 exclusive video essays up there now.